Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burness-Watson. Coming up on today's programme, the death toll in Gaza has now passed the 58,000 mark. During the course of the weekend, 6 Palestinians were killed, 6 children I should say, and 17 others were injured in central Gaza. This as they tried to collect water. Meanwhile, Israel says it was the result of missile malfunction and that it regrets harm to uninvolved civilians. Also coming up today, growing anticipation over a possible shift in the Trump administration's approach towards the war in Ukraine. We'll be asking what might this mean for the country, and could sanctions, tougher sanctions, be on the horizon? Hello and welcome. We begin with Gaza, where civilian death toll continues to rise. Well, local authorities are reporting that at least 28 people have been killed across the war-torn strip today alone. Well, these latest strikes come just a day after 6 children were killed whilst waiting to fill water containers beside a tanker at the Al-Nusayrat refugee camp, which is in central Gaza. Well, one Palestinian child, Mohammed Abu Dhaka, lost his parents and brother in the recent deadly strikes. Let's take a listen.
We had barely moved 5 meters from our home when a shell struck us. I was catapulted along with my father, my mother, my brother to the middle of the street. They all died. My brother and mother were left in pieces in the middle of the road.
Well, for more on this, we can cross now to Rosalia Bollen, who is a spokesperson for UNICEF. Rosalia, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. The death toll in Gaza, we're told, has now passed the 58,000 mark. Just tell us what the latest is that you're hearing about the situation on the ground and where the worst of the violence is concentrated.
I mean, to start off, I think it's important to remember that this number is very, very overwhelming. It's a very large number, but we're talking about real people here. There's at least 17,000 children reported killed within that toll. Those aren't numbers. Those are boys and girls. They're toddlers and babies. That's what we're talking about. In reality, what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is mass casualty events, really on a daily basis. On Thursday, there were 9 children killed, with 4 women. They were queuing with their mothers, waiting to get nutrition support, UNICEF nutrition support in Deir al-Balah. Yesterday morning, 7 children were killed, waiting for water in Al-Nusayrat. And I just saw another report, a breaking news report of several people killed, including possibly children, in a strike on tents in the Al-Mawasi area in southern Gaza, where families have been told to go to. So 21 months into this war, there is no safe place in Gaza. At times, violence has been concentrated in specific areas, especially the eastern side of the Gaza Strip, the northern part of Gaza, Rafah, eastern Khan Yunis. But the reality is that people aren't safe anywhere.
Yeah, and you're right to point out that we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about human beings. And it even helps sometimes to give them an identity. I was reading about a 17-year-old boy. His name is Taysir Mansour, living in constant pain. He's been in pain for a year. He suffered severe burns when an Israeli missile struck his home. That destroyed his home, killed his mother, injured his siblings. His situation is now getting worse every day, we're told, because he hasn't got adequate access to medical care. Both his hands might now need to be amputated, and at the same time, he's got limited access to food and medicine. I mean, it's a horrific series of events. How common is that kind of a story, do you think?
Sadly, this story isn't just heart-wrenching by itself. The sad reality is that this is not a unique case. It is not an exception. I have interviewed dozens of children myself inside Gaza, children who are severely ill, children who've been severely injured in bombardments, who have been lucky enough to survive the airstrike, but then are unable to access the medical care that they need because of the stress that the health system is under. Hospitals themselves have been turned into battle zones. They face very severe shortages of medicines, and there's just this constant flow of severely injured people day in, day out. I also want to point out that we're talking about injured children, injured civilians, but the reality is that injured doesn't really cover the extent of the injuries that people have very often. I've seen children who've had their limbs amputated. I've seen children who've been burned on very large parts of their bodies. We're not just talking about a couple of scratches. We're talking about children who will likely have to cope for the rest of their lives with their injuries. So sadly, this is a common reality for children and their parents in Gaza. It's the daily struggle of the doctors and the nurses who try to save people's lives without having the means to do so, really. This is also why it's important that more countries in the world take in severely injured patients from Gaza and severely ill patients with pre-existing medical conditions. The hospital system needs to be rehabilitated, but until that's the case, people risk dying right now. They're dying in waiting. They can't afford to wait. So it's important that more people from the Gaza Strip, especially child patients, can get medically evacuated.
Sure, and I just wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously UNICEF is focused on children, and there was one story of a little boy who didn't die, although his parents and 3 brothers all did. He only survived because he was outside getting water. I mean, this is a heartbreaking story, and as we've been saying, these sorts of stories are not isolated. But what's going to happen to that little boy and little boys like that and little girls like that who are now orphans? What's in place to protect them, because they're extremely vulnerable, aren't they?
Well, what we do see in Gaza is really fantastic solidarity of the community. So for children who've become separated from their parents because the parents have been detained, the parents have been injured, parents have been killed, or simply they're in another part of Gaza and unable to get back to their children, we do see that within the community, within the extended family in the first place, but also in the larger community, people care for these type of children. That doesn't mean that their situation is easy, because there isn't enough food to eat in Gaza. Families really struggle to feed their children, to have enough to eat themselves, and it means that they have an extra mouth to feed. So that is a very important challenge. But these children are certainly exposed to even more risks, protection risks, than other children. When they are on their own, they're at heightened risk of exploitation, of abuse. So their situation is extremely difficult.
I just want to pick up on one thing you were saying at the beginning. We were talking about how, according to UNICEF, 50,000 Palestinian children have been killed or injured in Gaza since October 2023. And yet Israel says these are merely Hamas numbers. They dispute them and say that people that use these numbers are constructing some kind of an anti-Israel narrative. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, my colleagues and I have been present on the ground inside Gaza. I happen to be outside of Gaza at the moment, but I've been there for the past 6 months. And UNICEF has had a continuous operational presence inside the Gaza Strip throughout this war. We visit children, we visit families, we interview caregivers, we interview health staff, teachers, and we see see the harm that is being done to children and to their families. We see the child injuries. We come across children who have been separated from their parents, or even worse, whose parents have been killed. So this is a daily occurrence that we simply come across and that we document.
Okay, and just I just wanted to talk to you about a couple of the other points that have been raised by UNICEF in the last few days. UNICEF says that more than 1 million children are in need of mental health and psychosocial support. I mean, they're perhaps the ones we don't see on our television screens because, of course, there's very limited access to medical care as it is. But when it comes to mental health issues, I can imagine there's even less support. But when we think about those 1 million children, we're talking about an issue that's going to have consequences, aren't we, for many decades to come?
Just to clarify for the viewers, so there's over 2 million people inside the Gaza Strip, and around half of the population is below 18. So there's around 1 million children inside Gaza, and we indeed believe that all of them, the entire child population, and frankly, the rest of the population too, is in very urgent need of mental health and psychosocial support. And that is because of these relentless bombardments. When you are in Gaza, you constantly hear the buzzing and the rumbling of drones and planes. You hear explosions. You hear planes approaching. You know a bomb is going to drop somewhere. You just don't know where. You wonder if it'll drop close to you. You're just constantly on edge. And so children are trapped in a very dangerous and toxic state of permanent stress. With the exception of the ceasefire earlier this year, there hasn't been any respite for children. Children whom I've interviewed talk about death. They're afraid, they're terrified of dying, but something they're even more afraid of is that their parents will die and that they will be left on their own. It's very widespread among the child population inside Gaza. So I'm very glad that you raised this, because the suffering isn't just physical, but it's also mental.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. We're going to have to leave it there. Rosalia Bollen, spokesperson for UNICEF, thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Now, the US President Donald Trump says that the United States is going to be sending, quote, very sophisticated equipment to Ukraine. And by that, he appears to mean Patriot air defense systems. Well, the US president says this decision is to help Ukraine fend off the threat posed by Russia. Well, that statement comes as his relations with the Russian President Vladimir Putin appear to be turning increasingly sour. Let's take a listen.
I haven't agreed on the number yet, but they're going to have some, because they do need protection. But the European Union is paying for it. We're not paying anything for it, but we will send it. It'll be business for us, and we will send them Patriots, which they desperately need, because Putin really surprised a lot of people. He talks nice, and then he bombs everybody in the evening. So there's a little bit of a problem there, and I don't like it.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross to London and speak to Jim Townsend, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for European and NATO policy at the Pentagon. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Jim. We just heard the US President there saying that some sophisticated weaponry is going to be sent in the direction of Ukraine. I mean, that seems to be a bit of a U-turn, doesn't it, by President Trump? And I'm wondering what you read into that.
Well, I think it is a bit of a U-turn. And I think what was very interesting to me was he said, well, you know, this is just going to be business. And he said the EU is going to pay for it. We're not going to pay for it. But the Ukrainians need it. So in a sense, he's kind of painting this as if it's a business deal to Putin. Like, hey, don't worry, it's just business. You know, I still love you. And so, but this is also the beginning of this idea that has been kicked around now that the European Union or European nations themselves will be buying these weapon systems from the United States and transferring them to Ukraine. And again, it's business for the U.S. And the Europeans will be the ones providing the assistance.
I'm wondering if part of the audience here as well is his own support base, that we're against the idea of this war continuing. And if President Trump can portray this as being, you know, a lucrative business for the United States, providing this weaponry to Ukraine, but have the EU pay for it, I mean, will that perhaps make them think it's perhaps a good idea that the war carries on?
Well, I mean, it's a very good point. You know, the audiences that he speaks to are many. And I think the audience that's considered his base at home, you're right. He's painting this as business. This is something that's good for the United States. It's America first. And so people shouldn't feel that the U.S. is getting sucked into this, or we're giving away all this equipment for free, or this kind of thing. So he is kind of covering his political tracks there with that base. And at the same time, those in the Congress who are very pro-Ukraine, he is also throwing them a bouquet by saying, look, we're going to give it to Ukraine. They need it. And so I'm going to give them what they need to protect themselves, to defend themselves. And then the audience, of course, is Putin. And he's saying to Putin, look, my patience is running thin. You're tapping me along, as he said earlier. And so we'll see if this is going to be a real sea change with Putin. It may not be.
I mean, we've heard President Trump sounding increasingly critical of President Putin. That's not the sort of thing we were hearing from him, let's say, 4 or 5 months ago. I mean, what do you think President Trump's next moves are going to be with regards to how he approaches Moscow?
Well, it might be this legislation that's moving through the Congress that supposedly is very, very big on sanctions, that it's going to have sanctions that really hurt. It's going to impact the oil business that Russia really depends on. It's going to impact other areas that have been kind of off limits in terms of sanctions. So this is something that I think will be the next move. The first one being, okay, we're going to give them some Patriot missiles. I mean, we're not sure exactly how many missiles, and if this is it the whole system, or is it just missiles? What is it that they're going to provide? But I think to answer your question, the next move is going to be will be with the Congress, and of course the president will have to sign that bill. So let's see what happens in the next few days.
Yeah, I don't know if we're talking about the same set of sanctions, but there is a bill sponsored by Senator Lindsey Graham, and President Trump is saying if anyone so much as deals with Russia, if indeed they go ahead with this and impose this next round of sanctions, they will be hit by 500% tariffs on their products. I mean, that would be a very, very strong deterrent. And I'm just wondering what you think the consequences of that would be.
Well, that's exactly, you're right. That's exactly the legislation I was mentioning earlier. And that's a key part of that legislation is the secondary sanctions on nations, as you point out, that nations that do business that buy the oil. So how will that work? I mean, with India, a country that's very important to us, they buy a lot of Russian oil. So will they really get a 500% tariff levied on them? So a lot of time what he does is these are negotiating tactics, or these are signals being sent, and he goes right up to the abyss and then pulls back. So we don't know, but I think what we're seeing though is if this legislation passes and he signs it, then for Putin, this is certainly a sign, whether it's assistance to Ukraine or it's this legislation, that he's starting to push Putin, and then we'll have to see what Putin does.
Right. I mean, what we've seen Putin do, at least in the last few weeks, is really step up the aerial campaign in Ukraine. I mean, hundreds of drones on an almost daily basis have been raining down on Ukraine. I mean, it really looks like Russia is in absolutely no mood for compromise. And any talk of a ceasefire at this particular juncture looks like very wishful thinking, doesn't it?
I think that's right. I find it hard to believe that these sanctions and the assistance to Ukraine will move Putin. He's right now feeling he's in the catbird seat, as we say. Yeah, he thinks that he's got the time on his side and momentum on his side, and he's going to wait us out. he's playing Trump, trying to avoid being trapped into, some kind of sitting down at a table to talk about a ceasefire. So, he's trying to walk both sides of the street. He'll appease Trump on the one hand. On the other hand, he'll bomb to smithereens the Ukraine as much as he possibly can. So, a lot. We'll have to see how much Putin will take, and it could very well be that these sanctions, if they are as tough as the Congress seems to think they are, maybe that'll have an impact. I don't know, but I just, like you said, I find it hard to believe at this point that Putin is going to be in any mood to sit down and talk about a ceasefire or even a peace treaty. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at what's happening on the battlefield, I mean, if one were to get inside the mind of the Russian president, he would say, why would I? I mean, clearly the Russians are making gains on the battlefield, whether anybody likes it or not. That's the reality. And so perhaps it would be, unrealistic to think that the Russians would think other than, let's carry on with this.
Well, it's been hard to find what it is that gives Putin enough pain to make him agree to sit down and talk about a ceasefire. A lot of people have pointed to the economy, the Russian economy, that it can't sustain this kind of defense spending and these kinds of costs that come with the war in Ukraine, and that maybe he's got another year under this current wartime economy before he's going to be in real trouble. But I've always felt that we overplay that point. But if these sanctions come in and no one's buying the oil, and also there's other methods being used to counteract those ghost ships, that are those tankers that are moving the Russian oil around. So there are efforts being made to really to impact his oil sales. If that's impacted and he doesn't have the resources coming in the coming year that he had last year, then it will be difficult. But I think we're talking in terms of a year or two. We're not really going to see a turnaround, no matter how hard the sanctions will hit, no matter how many ships that they seem to pull out of action. I think we're not going to see a turnaround for a year or so, even in the best case.
Right, because a lot of people we've spoken to on this channel have given us a whole series of indicators as to why the Russian economy is starting to look like it's really in trouble. And that could spell further trouble for President Putin in turn, who could start to feel some real pressure from his own population, maybe ministers in his inner sanctum. But you don't seem to be thinking that we're at a point that this is really beginning to feel like an Achilles heel, at least not yet.
Not yet. He doesn't have to worry about his next election. He doesn't, the Russian people seem to be, they're not in the streets. The price of bread hasn't skyrocketed. He has talked about the economy being, feeling the pinch of this war. But it's not like in the West, I think, where, if in the U.S. or in some European countries, if our economies were showing this kind of strain, there would be people in the street, or there would be a political liability for the politicians. But in Russia, it's just not that way. And I don't think we can judge them on how we can't judge them on how we would react. They're different, and I just don't see Putin being moved by his economy and the impact of his economy on the Russian people. I don't see him being moved to go to the peace table anytime soon. I really don't. Not within a year or so.
Yeah, but I mean, up until now, I mean, the Russian economy's had growth, and President Putin's been able to shrug it off and say, not having any effect on us, those sanctions, so try something else. But if it does start to happen, then perhaps he'll have a different way of approaching things.
Well, that's right, and he's still selling his oil, and I believe there's some Europeans and others who are even buying the oil. So that's the thing. His oil is his Achilles heel, and that's what Ukraine is trying to do. That they're firing drones and impacting the pipelines and where the refinery and that's this type of thing in Russia. So they're hitting the production of gasoline of all types and oils. They're also hitting, as I said, the ships that are carrying the oil. And if these sanctions hit the countries that are buying the oil, then, maybe there won't be that kind of oil revenue coming into Russia. But again, for all of that to happen together, to have a major impact, it's not right around the corner.
I mean, it's starting to look, 6 months into the second Trump presidency, that the US president's approach to Russia and to Ukraine really isn't particularly different from that of the previous administration, is it?
Well, people are saying that. I think it's different to me when it comes to the assistance to Ukraine. The assistance going to Ukraine still today is a bow wave from the Biden assistance. It was already in the pipeline, or it was moving into the pipeline when Trump was inaugurated. So Trump right now has not put together a package of assistance that he can call his own. So he certainly has not been providing the assistance. And what we have been so worried about in terms of he and his staff just parroting Putin's talking points, that seems to have modified somewhat. We're not hearing that anymore. The relationship with Zelensky has gotten better. So, he's starting to move into Biden territory. But let's see if that results in assistance. That's what we really need. Is assistance, and he's announced that, something, and he's gonna talk to the NATO Secretary General today, I believe, and so things are beginning to move. And let's see what he does in terms of his relationship with Russia. That will really tell us if we're going to see something more helpful in terms of assistance to Ukraine.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, things have changed immeasurably since that infamous Oval Office encounter between President Zelensky and President Trump. At that time, the Ukrainian leader was described by President Trump as being a modestly successful comedian and a dictator. I mean, now they seem to be getting along quite well. Do you think this is now going to be the end of the road for that rapprochement between, or that attempted rapprochement between Washington and Moscow?
I don't think so. And I hate to say that. It could be the beginning of the end, but I think the relationship that Trump wants to have with Putin still really colors a lot of what he does. He sees business deals. He wants to be buddy-buddy with a strong man like Putin. He wants to do something that makes him desirable in terms of the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, there's a lot of things that motivate him. And he doesn't want to be embarrassed, though. He doesn't want to be humiliated by Putin, by being tapped along, by being taken advantage of. So, I don't think he's ready yet to throw in the towel. But we'll have to see how Putin reacts to this assistance, and if he will actually do something that Trump can take to the bank in terms of a change in attitude towards a ceasefire or something along those lines. We'll have to see. But this is still a negotiation, and these are negotiating tactics. And Trump is trying to shape what Putin does. And nothing has worked so far, and he's getting frustrated. And so let's see what Putin does as a result of these tactics that Trump is using, and then let's see Trump's response. It's like watching a tennis game. We're just watching the ball go back and forth, sitting in the stands.
Yeah, I mean, it's turning into a long game of tennis, not quite the overnight game of tennis that we were told it would be, along the campaign trail and well into January. I mean, what do you think the original strategy was by President Trump at the beginning? To try to appease Putin, to vilify Volodymyr Zelensky, and then what? What was the point of all that, do you think? What do you read into it?
Well, it's hard to tell. I think he certainly came in with an incomplete understanding of the complexities of this war between those two countries and the hatreds, and the fact that he can't just force them both to sit down and throw bones to each of them and somehow make each of them agree to give up this and then I'll give up that. It's not a business deal. It's not getting two recalcitrant land developers to sit down and cut a deal between the two that benefits Trump. It's different. And so the only thing I can think of is that going into this, and talking about settling it in 24 hours, Trump was just assuming that he could bring Putin along, and that Zelensky has no other option, and they will both be kind of forced into coming up with some kind of agreement. And of course, that wasn't something that Putin was going to do. He didn't want to, make that kind of play. And then for Zelensky, he'd do anything that Trump tells him to do, as long as he can get assistance coming into him. And he's not ready for the ceasefire table either, unless he feels he can get something, acceptable to him, which I don't think he feels that's the way it is right now. So I think with Trump, in coming into this situation, he really had a superficial understanding of the complexities, and that both parties are not ready to sit down and talk, and there's nothing he could do to force them to sit down.
Okay, and just lastly, Jim, I mean, were you to be called upon to offer advice to the US president as to what he should do next, I mean, what would your advice be in order to try to break this impasse and bring things to a conclusion?
Well, I think I would carry on with what he seems to be doing now, which is sending Ukraine a lot of assistance and making sure Putin understands that there's a lot more where that came from, and that he was no longer trying to twist the arm of Zelensky. That he in fact has not changed sides. And so I would do that, and at the same time, I would really go after Russian oil, and really make that hurt Putin, and then see where this goes. But he's got to understand he doesn't have all the time in the world. This is Putin. Trump's got to make him understand that he doesn't have all the time in the world just to wait everyone out. And he's got to make sure that Putin knows that we're going to provide Zelensky all the assistance he needs to make sure that there's not going to be a win on the battlefield. And then the third thing is to make the sanctions really hurt, particularly on oil, and then talk about business deals, in the future if Putin comes along. But he's got to make Putin hurt, and he's got to make Zelensky really strong. And then let's see if the economy begins to really falter, if the oil begins to dry up. Okay, well, if he's watching and he's listening, perhaps he'll take that on board. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Jim Townsend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for European and NATO Policy at the Pentagon. Thank you for your time. Well, let's get more on this, and we can speak now to Sir Gerald Howarth, who's a former UK Defence Minister. Sir Gerald, always a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much indeed for your time. We've heard from President Trump, who says he's going to be sending some fresh Patriot air defence system supplies to Ukraine. I mean, that sounds like a pretty major U-turn, doesn't it? And I'm wondering what you read into it.
Well, it's long overdue, Tom. It is extraordinary. It has taken the President of the United States so long to understand the nature of the threat that Russia poses, not just to Ukraine, but to the rest of Europe and indeed to the wider world. And basically, we've wasted 6 months of this presidency whilst President Trump has worked out whether he could trust President Putin or not. And unfortunately, President Trump's naivety in believing that somehow he could strike a deal, for that is the language that Trump uses all the time, the kind of commercial strike-a-deal concept, which is not appropriate for international situations like this. But he has demonstrated so much naivety over the past 6 months. But if he is now has woken up and realized that he has got to deploy as much military might in support of Ukraine as possible, and join the rest of us who have been doing so, and indeed his predecessor who was, then that is good news.
I mean, if I'm to defend the US president here and say, look, we're 3 years plus into a war, no end in sight, costing an awful lot of money to the United States, lots of lives, not to mention, the thousands of Ukrainian, Russian lives on the battlefield. He tried to do something that the previous president didn't try to do, which was to somehow approach this in a different way, reach out to the Russians, build bridges, rather than burn them. That's how he'd argue he approached this. I mean, maybe it hasn't worked, but at least he tried something new. What do you say to that?
Well, it was completely naive. And the fact that it hasn't worked is proof of his naivety. I was not a huge fan of his predecessor, President Biden, but at least President Biden put together a $66 billion package to support Ukraine. And your viewers should remember that it's not just the United States who has been supporting Ukraine with military equipment. The United Kingdom, France, many other European countries have been doing so as well. And the Europeans have fully matched in financial terms the amount that the United States has contributed in support of Ukraine. But of course, it was utter folly to believe that President Putin had any intention of striking any kind of sensible deal to bring this war to an end. Indeed, in 2021, he made it explicitly clear in a speech that his intention was effectively to rebuild the Soviet Union. And if I may quote, he said there is no historical basis for the idea of the U.S. as a nation separate from the Russians. That's been his view all along. He does not believe that Ukraine should be a sovereign state, notwithstanding that his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, together with President Clinton of the United States and Prime Minister John Major of the United Kingdom, had agreed that the parties should respect the sovereignty and independence and existing borders of Ukraine in 1995.
I just wanted to ask you about another matter before I address some of those other issues. We heard a clip not long before we crossed to you of the US president saying the United States isn't actually going to be paying for those Patriot air defense systems. They'll be supplying them, but it'll be the European Union that pays for them. Perhaps he means by that as well the UK as well. But I mean, regardless of who pays for them, if it's not the United States, what do you think the president's doing here by providing the weaponry, but retrieving or recuperating some of the money for it? Do you think that's the right way to go?
Well, this is part of his narrative. He sees everything in commercial terms, as I said earlier. So he sees it in terms, everything is seen in terms of striking a deal, whether it's with China or Russia or the European Union or trading partners. Everything is a deal. It's all transactional. That is not how international politics works, and it's certainly not how the threat of major international war works. You've got to understand that diplomacy and the use of force is not a transactional thing. It is a strategic decision to be made. And he has been very slow at coming round to making that decision. The idea, though, that the Europeans should pay, again, I repeat, the Europeans have paid just as much as the United States taxpayer has done, but he has always made it a point. He made it in his first presidency. Prime Minister David Cameron, whose government I served, he made it clear in 2014 that the Europeans had to do much more to step up to the plate to finance the cost of NATO and not leave 70% of the cost to be borne by the US taxpayer. But look, Tom, my view is that the real imperative is to bring this war to an end. It will not be brought to an end by the president picking up the phone to President Putin and say, "Hi, Vlad, let's sit around the table and do a deal." It will not end that way. It will only end by Russia being driven out of a sovereign state which they have brutally and illegally invaded. Because if they are not driven out, Putin will continue with his exercise to recreate the former Soviet Union, and he will threaten other states. And potentially, he will also seek to test NATO's resolve, perhaps by some minor incursion in a sovereign NATO state, provoking then the question, would we resort to Article 5, that is full-scale war? So these are high stakes, but my view has been absolutely clear as many times as I've been on your program. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've made it clear right from the start. The West needed to step up to the plate and do everything possible to support Ukraine. We've prevaricated, we've dithered, we've looked at our naval. So should we contribute tanks? Should we contribute combat aircraft? Months and months wasted while Putin just threw more and more men as cannon fodder into the battle against a sovereign state, Ukraine.
Indeed, Sir Gerald, you have indeed said the same thing consistently from the beginning of our conversation several months ago. So too has the Ukrainian president. You're very aligned with him. He's just quoted as saying in the last 24 hours, "It is clear that Moscow will not stop unless its unreasonable ambitions are curbed through strength." That's exactly what you're saying, isn't it?
Absolutely spot on. And what astonishes me is that a nation as sophisticated as the United States has taken so long. Took long enough under President Biden, but we've seen this dithering under President Trump as well. But a sophisticated nation like the United States, with a huge amount of experience in international affairs, taking part in the defeat of tyranny in World War I and World War II, the idea that's taken them so long to understand the importance of deploying might against tyrants like Putin, who is basically completely unaccountable. Unlike President Trump, unaccountable to his electorate, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer accountable to the electorate. Here, presidents and others across Europe accountable to their electorates. Putin is not accountable to his people. He's got a puppet parliament. And unless you understand history, tyrants have to be addressed, confronted, and defeated. That is what happened in 1982 when President Galtieri of Argentina invaded sovereign British territory in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands. And the Foreign Office here was probably wanting to give them away to Argentina anyway. But Margaret Thatcher, whom I was privileged to serve as her parliamentary private secretary, Mrs. Thatcher said, no, we shall recover the Falkland Islands by force. We did. And the message that sent around the world that tyrants better beware because they would be confronted by a powerful nation like the United Kingdom was a very important contributor to international order and international peace and security. That has all been jeopardized by weakness of the West in the past few years.
It looks like things are back on track with regards to relations between Kyiv and Washington. Keith Kellogg, who is the US Special Envoy to Ukraine, has been in Kyiv in the last day, and the Ukrainian leaders calling it a productive dialogue. They've had a productive conversation. I mean, it does sound, doesn't it, like Washington has done this U-turn and that they really are now back on side supporting Ukraine. But does it look like the United States is a reliable ally here?
Well, bearing in mind that President Zelensky, after his bruising and insulting treatment of the White House, has been treading on broken glass ever since, trying to tiptoe his way through a minefield of protocols and being nice to the White House. So I don't attach a huge amount of importance to that. But whether relations are sufficiently back on track for President Trump to decide that he now has to give the kind of support to your predecessor gave, who knows? But we await an announcement from the White House imminently as to whether press reports are correct that he intends to deploy Patriot missiles, which are defensive missiles, to thwart this torrent of drone attacks that are coming from Russia, and of course not being directed at military targets, being directed at blocks of flats, apartments, and civilian infrastructure. And whether he's going to be taking a step further and provide Ukraine with long-range weapons which can attack Russian facilities, which is a big step and is not without its risk, but I believe, for the reasons I've consistently given, is absolutely vital. And don't forget that the Russian economy is pretty well teetering on the brink. They are having to contribute so much of their national output to defense, and they have nothing. There's nothing in the shops here. I don't know about there in the Gulf, or any Russian products any of you want to buy, but there's not a product on the shelves here that we want to buy, except perhaps a bottle of vodka to drown our sorrows at what this brutal man is doing. The only thing they've got is oil and other natural resources, and they are just having to exploit those to make a living. And they're running out of gas. Not gas, literally. They're running out of what the Americans will run. They're running out of fuel.
Do you think this is the end of the rapprochement effort by the White House? Because we've heard from the Russians only in the last couple of minutes a statement from Moscow saying US dialogue will continue despite efforts to derail it. Do you think that process will continue, or do you think President Trump will decide time to give up?
Well, of course, that's what Moscow will say, because they've been able to play the President Trump around their little finger. Here we are. We're 7 months into the presidency, and look where we are. Ukraine is still battling just to survive. So, of course, Russia is going to say, rapprochement will continue, and he might pick up the phone to President Trump. Whether, of course, the Americans really have woken up, whether this administration has woken up, whether it has really decided that it has been duped, that it has falsely assumed that it could do a deal with President Putin or not, I do not know. But what I do know is that this president is something of a maverick. You cannot tell what he's going to do next. You know, it was only a few weeks ago we saw that humiliating and I thought quite disgusting treatment of President Zelensky in the White House. And today, a few weeks later, we have the president talking about possibly deploying long-range missiles to attack deep within Russia. So we've traveled a long way in a very few weeks, but who knows? He is a man whose decision-making, I think, will be a subject of several theses that are institutions of learning around the world.
Yes, indeed, we've come a very long way from February, when President Trump was referring to President Zelensky as a dictator, and so were many people in President Trump's inner circle that we spoke to. Just before we crossed to you, we were talking to Jim Townsend, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy at the Pentagon. This was his advice to President Trump as to how to bring this war to what he would say is the just conclusion. He said, make the sanctions hurt, make Zelensky strong, and go after the economy. Is there anything you'd add to that?
Make the sanctions hurt, yeah, but I don't attach a huge amount of value to sanctions. People can evade sanctions. Don't forget, Russia has allies around the world who are willing to help them. Second point, do all we can to support Ukraine. Absolutely, yeah, that's what I've been saying from day one. That is an absolute fundamental. Sorry, what was the third point?
The economy.
The economy.
Go after it.
Well, the way to go after the only way to go after the Russian economy, as I say, there's nothing. We don't want to buy their cars. We don't want to buy their washing machines. We don't want to buy anything from made in Russia, except possibly, as I say, their natural resources. If you can close down their gas and oil supplies, and don't forget, it took our European partners, our European friends, a hell of a long time to come to the conclusion that they had to switch off the gas supply that they were receiving from Russia. It's all been done in slow motion. And as I say, I don't attach a huge amount of value to that happening. But I do think that giving the weapons, as indeed Mike Pompeo, who addressed a conference I attended in Odessa a few weeks ago, sponsored by Lord Ashcroft, very, very useful, Black Sea Security Forum. And former Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, he was very clear that we had to give Ukraine the weapons necessary to do the job that needs to be done. So perhaps the worm is turning a bit, but that is the only way. I'm sorry, but there is no deal to be done with Putin. The only thing he understands is brute force. He has exerted brute force to subdue pretty well 1/3 of Ukraine, a sovereign territory. He has had absolutely no concern for his men that he is thrown into this battle. He has recruited cannon fodder from North Korea to help him. This man has no humanity whatever. The only thing he understands is a firm fist, and that is what is needed. And as I say, having been in Ukraine a couple of times in the last 6 weeks, I am so encouraged by their extraordinary resilience, their determination to recover that part of their country which has been seized by Russia. And we should be ashamed of our slow response to what has been done to these people and the suffering that they have endured. I'm wearing on my wrist, I don't know if you can see it, but I have a bit of
just
steel.
Hold it up a little higher, Sir Gerald. There we are.
That steel is from the Azov factory, the Azov steel factory, given to me by a Ukrainian friend.
Could you show it one more time? So we had the banner in the way of you there.
Yeah,
So
it's quite
steel.
small, but there you can see it. It's just a little bit of steel from the Azov steel plant destroyed by Russia.
Right.
But when you think what the Ukrainians have done, basically they've driven the Russian Navy out of their warm water port of Sevastopol. They've had to retreat to the eastern part of the Black Sea. They've held Russia, massive country. They've held them off for 3 years, 3.5 years, for their injured veterans. It really is impressive. They are impressive people, and we do have to stand by them. And finally, it is in our interest to stand by them, because if Putin wins here, 2 things. One, he will not stop at Ukraine. Beware Moldova. Beware the Baltic states. Secondly, other tyrants around the world. And I look at President Xi of China, who has already declared that he intends to take back Taiwan into mainland China by force, if necessary, by 2050. These other tyrants will be emboldened as well. This is in our interest to give Ukraine victory. I don't pray for peace. I pray for victory for Ukraine.
And just lastly, I mean, it does look like things are changing. We were talking about how Keith Kellogg has been in Kyiv today. We've got the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Washington. The German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius is there as well. And we're being told President Trump is going to issue a, quote, major statement on the war. Are you hopeful, based on which direction you would like things to go in, that things are indeed heading in the right direction? Yes,
I think I'm Tom, and the language is different. It looks as I don't think they'd allow these press reports to run had they been without foundation. I'm encouraged that he's meeting Mark Rutte today, because he's the Secretary General of NATO. He is former Netherlands Prime Minister, and he has been very bold indeed in warning about the risk of war with Russia, and that we need to rearm fast, as indeed has our former head of the army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, whom I know. And General Sir Patrick last week warned us all that we need to prepare for a potential war against Russia as soon as 2030. So the fact that people like this have been speaking out in words of one syllable, and that they are now having the ear of the President of the United States, hopefully that is an encouraging sign. If I may also say, of course, the United Kingdom, present Labour government has decided to reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons, which we gave up in 1998. And those would be air-delivered weapons, which would mean that we had another layer of defense beyond between conventional warfare and our ultimate deterrent, which is the Trident submarine located somewhere in the world, which is at 24/7 continuous at-sea deterrent. That is our final deterrent. But it means that we would have to use that. So by introducing tactical nuclear weapons, we introduce a further defense layer, which I think is a good idea. So things are happening, but they need to happen fast, Tom. We can't hang around. And, I suppose the interesting thing about President Trump is that once he's made up his mind to do something, as he did in Iran, he does it. And he does it with substantial force and effect. So perhaps, as you and I are sitting here on the eastern side of the Atlantic, perhaps over there on the other side of the Atlantic, there is a seismic shift taking place. If it is really to be welcomed, and I will mute my criticisms. Obviously, history is history, but if greater joy is there in heaven over the one sinner that repenteth than over the 99 that require no repentance. Quote the Bible.
All right, well, on that biblical note, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Sir Gerald Howarth, former UK Defence Minister, thank you for your time. That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.